Hey guys, my name is Bethany George. I'm a senior biology major at Georgia State University. This presentation was made for a course called Nutritional Neuroscience, and it is about the environmental factors that affect cognitive development and cognition from really prenatal stages all the way to adulthood. So let's get started with some statistics, of course. So, among 34 other OECD countries, and OECD stands for Organization of Economic and Cooperative Development. Um, Countries including Austria, Canada, Belgium, Japan, Korea, Mexico, the Netherlands, Israel, the UK, Ireland, and Greece, among a couple others. Students in the US um, ranked below average, performing 17th in reading, 20th in science, and 27th in mathematics. Ironically enough, the US has one of the highest spending limits per student per year at $115,000 per student per year. This is compared to similarly performing countries like the Slavic Republic, which only spends $53,000 per student per year. So, what's really going on here? Well, a 15% variation in student performance can be attributed to the socioeconomic backgrounds of many U.S. students. So in 2015, 88.8% of females in the U.S. were enrolled in secondary school versus 32.3% of males. And to put this into perspective, 14% of women were incarcerated in federal and state prisons in 2014 versus 20% of males incarcerated in federal or state prisons. And this is quite alarming because statistics say or show that it's not much more likely if you're a male in America that you continue on to secondary school than it is for you to be incarcerated. And if we were to look at the demographics of the incarceration rates, that is alarming in itself, but that is a slightly different subject. Um, so let's continue on. Well, there are three major factors for the purposes of this presentation contributing to cognitive development and function. They are socioeconomic status, childhood adversities, and heavy metal exposure. So, let's begin with socioeconomic status. Socioeconomic status is characterized by family income, occupational class, education, and access to things like healthcare and adequate healthcare and housing. And of course, there are positive and negative aspects of socioeconomic status that contributes to cognitive ability. Positive, negative. But let's start with the positive. So, parental education, occupational class, and assets really go hand in hand because it's easy to understand. The more education you have, it's very likely the higher occupational class you'll be in, and the more assets you'll have or have access to. And children of these parents, of course, perform better. They have a better foundation. Parental and cognitive stimulation is also very important, and I included cognitive stimulation because even though you spend the vast majority of your time with your parents as a child, it's not just parental stimulation, it is cognitive stimulation in general that allows children to fare better. Social environment and supportive behavior is something that really stuck out to me because it's not just at home, it's not just your home environment, but it is your social environment. It's more distant factors, um, school, um, teams that you could be on, things like that, that are very important for children to develop optimally. um, Supportive behavior from um, teachers and relatives, and really just encouragement and positive reinforcement, so children not only begin to enjoy learning, but um, are just given a better environment to do so. So the last two, but certainly not least, arguably um, the most important, are breastfeeding and nutrition. So there are three criteria for breastfeeding, and they were absolute, or just general exposure, whether the child was breastfed or not, the duration of breastfeeding, and intensity, or exclusivity. So this is whether um, the child was exclusively breastfed, or breastfeeding was complementary to formula feedings. And breastfeeding in general was a positive predictor for cognitive development of children up to 12 months, regardless of prenatal exposure to pesticides. Actually, breastfeeding showed protective effects against children, exposure of children to pesticides such as DDT. And the effects were lasting. They were observed um, through growth rates and cognitive scores of 4-year-olds. So they're long lasting effects. Um, and on average, children that were breastfed for 4 to 5 months um, scored 9 points higher in cognitive ability than children who were breastfed for less than a month. And these tests were at 18 through 24 months. Also, children that were exclusively breastfed, um, the benefits far exceeded both general breastfeeding and even the longer term duration of breastfeeding. Children that were exclusively breastfed fared better. Another important, very important factor is parents who established early dietary patterns consisting of fruits, vegetables, homemade foods, and breast milk. There was a positive correlation seen in cognitive ability and development for their children versus parents who established dietary patterns that included processed foods and snacks. So healthy eating is important from a very young age. So now, the negative contributors. Um, for one, it is very important, the status of the mom um, during prenatal development, and just in general, the maternal status is very important to the status of the child. Um, Children that were exposed to mothers at high risk for prenatal stress um, the toddlers showed decreases in cognitive scores, as well as depression, but as well as stress, higher levels of stress, prenatal stress, which was assessed via cortisol levels, um, was related to a decrease in cognitive scores. Social support. Social support for the mother during pregnancy and after pregnancy were very important. And mothers that had low levels of social support, um, their children had negative, there were negative effects on their cognitive scores. Institutional and foster care also play a role, and family structure. So, having the mother, the father, and a solid family foundation were also very key to successful cognitive development and ability. So, the majority of these negative contributors were seen at or below the poverty line. So, as we can see here, poverty is defined as the state of being extremely poor or the state of being inferior in quality or insufficient in amount. Um, via healthcare.gov, the poverty line is approximately $11,000 for one person, $16,000, approximately $16,000 for a household of two. And I just want to say this was very interesting because, speaking on myself personally, um, $11,000 isn't a lot of money. My rent alone is roughly like $900. So that leaves about $300 for food, utilities, transportation, or emergencies. So the idea of poverty, it's not necessarily someone homeless living on the street or whatever. However, most of the time you would perceive poverty. It's a little bit more common than we think, unfortunately. So the next factor was childhood adversities, which is basically abuse experienced by the child, psychological, physical, or substance abuse. And they were characterized by childhood traumatic experiences. Um, the subjects were asked, well, yeah, they were children, have they ever been beaten, kicked, or a victim of violence? This corresponded to physical abuse. Um, Subjects that were tormented or threatened with violence were subject to psychological abuse, and children. And I might add that a lot of the research, I say child or children, but a lot of this research is continuous up until maybe around, I believe, about 22. So we're thinking child. I say child, but a lot of it carries on to what we would consider adulthood. Um, but for substance abuse, um, the question was asked, has someone in your family used alcohol or drugs that caused you to worry? And if the subject marked yes, then they were subject to uh, substance abuse. Also, there is a critical period model that demonstrates a peak influence on cognitive development and ability in the ages from 3 to 6. And in these ages, children were very highly susceptible to negative or positive environmental influences. The third factor, heavy metal exposure. This one is actually quite interesting and quite alarming. But lead, lead, lead. So I know recently we've heard a lot about lead. For one, we see in Flint, the Flint water crisis that started in 2014, and as we can see, the date on this article is October 17th, 2016. So it's still going. It's still something to worry about. Um, as well as lead detected in water at 5 Cherry Hill schools. Not sure where Cherry Hills is, but this was November 3rd. So this is a very current situation. Um, Lead has Negative effects beginning in utero in the first trimester and postnatally. So there was a decrease in math and reading scores of 7-year-olds that studies suggest were possibly linked to blood lead levels as low as 3 micrograms per liter. Now, previously, the blood lead level of concern um, given by the CDC was 10 micrograms per liter. It's been recently, I'm not sure how recently, lowered to 5 micrograms per liter, but either way it goes, 3 is still less than 5. So this is something to pay attention to. Um, on average, male children born to mothers with less education and lower incomes had higher blood lead levels. And minority children who live in substandard housing, a characteristic of poverty, were highest at risk and very oftentimes had elevated levels of lead, blood lead levels. Fluoride, good old fluoride, keep those teeth strong, or whatever. But fluoride, adverse side effects seen here were seen in with blood lead levels, blood fluoride levels as low as under 4 micrograms per liter. Recently, once again, the CDC lowered the acceptable fluoride levels in public water from, I'm not sure from what, I'm sorry, but I know it is now 0.7 milligrams per liter, which is to me not very low because studies have shown lowered cognition with levels as low as or less than 1 to 1.5 milligrams per liter. This is in the public water alone. This does not take into account fluoride in toothpaste and other places where fluoride exposure could occur. And I think it's also interesting, I haven't taken a toxicology class as of yet, but it would be interesting to see the clearance rates of how fast the body can get this fluoride and the lead out of your systems, because if adverse side effects are seen at 1 milligram and there is 0.7 milligrams of fluoride per liter of water, then I'm sure it is pretty easy for fluoride to accumulate and reach dangerous levels. But this is something that should be researched some more. So, what are the neurological effects of food? Because what you're about to eat can certainly kill you. Specifically, Western diet. Very high carbohydrates, high sugars are carbs. Diets, long-term effects of intake of high carbohydrate diets, was increased weight and a significant increase in leptin levels. Also, working memory deficits were seen in Western diet fed subjects, as well as higher plasma levels of resistant corticosteroid and LPS. which is lipopolysaccharide. And I believe that was a substance used for um, research in certain the subjects were rats. So in these rats, and I'd like to make a note that um, these elevated corticosteroid levels and leptin levels and weight, the increase was also seen with stress. Um, there was an increase in um, interleukin 6, which um, is involved in peripheral inflammation, as well as interleukin 6 in hypothalamal mRNA, I hope I said that correctly, as well as increases in interleukin 1b in the hippocampus. Um, so, stress, like I said, you see elevated corticosteroid and body weight levels, as well as a decrease in diameter and dendritic length of hippocampal neurons, and a reduction in the density of calbindin GABAergic, which are inhibitory neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex, as well as the um, prefrontal cortex, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Um, Also, something to take into consideration is that obesity is an epidemic in the US. Now, whether this is related to chronic stress or awful diet or both, is something that deserves research. So, some potential therapies. For one, starting with the reversal of perpetual poverty. That is a great place to start because we see that the effects of being born into and growing up in poverty, well, actually, the longer you're in poverty, the longer lasting the effects are, the longer lasting and more severe the effects are. Also, there are many studies linking vitamin D and B deficiencies to different cognitive anomalies and possibly neurological diseases. So, vitamin D um, supplementation, and not just necessarily supplementation, but um, vitamin D and B at therapeutic doses. So, these are really high doses. I read in a research paper that was on the vitamin D toxicity. And just before anyone says vitamin B is water soluble. So it's very hard to build a lot of that up in your system because what you don't use, you basically pee out. Vitamin D, on the other hand, is not water soluble, it's lipid soluble, so it can accumulate. And the toxicity um, levels were roughly, I think, around 300,000 um, micrograms or milligrams, um, like weekly multiple injections of 300,000 weekly um, milligrams in older um, older individuals. This is maybe around like 50 to 60 years old. So it's kind of tough to get too much vitamin D. Very easy to get too little. Um, in fact, vitamin D deficiency is seen quite often in lower socioeconomic um, statist, if that is the right way to say it. If it's not, I'm sorry, excuse me. Children. Also, there's a lot of promising research for meditation and awareness for treatment of um, different neurological disorders, depression, Alzheimer's, lots and lots of things. So, yeah, these are potential therapies that should be explored. Once again, I am Bethany George. I hope you got a lot out of this presentation. If you have any questions, email me. I'll include my email in a link below. All right, thanks.